This image has been meaning a lot to me lately. The image of rethinking, recovering, rebuilding. There's a lot of words that start with re, and they're important words. We'll be using a few of them this week and in the coming weeks. So it's an image to help us to focus. But first we're going to review just quickly. So January 7th in Jeremiah 29, God brought us Chad Cron, who spoke to us from God's word. And we asked ourselves, what will it look like to pray and work for the peace and prosperity? That word is actually shalom, right? Imagine a place where nobody has any transportation needs because they're taken care of. Everybody has food. Everybody has everything they need. There's no death. There's no divorce. There's no financial need. Everybody's getting along. Can you imagine a family gathering where everybody was getting along and people who didn't used to get along, suddenly they're getting along? That's shalom. That's peace and prosperity. That's shalom as the Bible understands it. In other words, being right in a right relationship with God, with each other, with ourselves, and with our environment, with our context around us. That's shalom. Think about that. Right relationship, all things reconciled. That's what the Bible's talking about when it talks about shalom and what Jesus came to do. So what does it look like for that peace and prosperity in our community while living in exile? In other words, we're not quite in heaven yet, are we? Well, I hope not. If you think this is heaven, you're shooting too low. The bar's too low. There's more coming. What's our next simple step? If God's calling us to invest in our community and in the peace and prosperity, what's our next simple step? And then on the 14th, we looked at Isaiah 43, which is a follow-up a little bit later on in Israel's history, but in the same era. As we reflect on where we've been and where Jesus is leading us, what should we remember? What should we forget? And what should we anticipate? Because Isaiah 43 says, forget the former things. That seems contradictory. And yet, right before that, the prophet's telling us all the things we need to remember. And then it says, forget the former things. And then it says, anticipate. So if you want to go back and watch that video, you can, or read Isaiah 43, verse 18 in particular. Then last week, Clint Mix took us through Exodus 32 and 33. And so we were asking God to go with us and to accept no substitutes for God's presence as we pursue his future for us. You may remember the nation of Israel built the golden calf with the help of Aaron, believe it or not, Moses' brother. And so Moses comes down with the Ten Commandments, and he sees this golden calf made out of the earrings and jewelry of the people, and he's like, what in the world? And Aaron had told the people, this is your God who took you out of Egypt and is going to lead you in. And Moses is like, what? That's a counterfeit. That'll never, ever accomplish what you think it will. None of our idols or replacements or substitutes for God ever fulfill what we think they're going to. They're empty promises, right? Fame, fortune, money, a new relationship. None of those things give us what they promise. Oh, it's going to be utopia. Just buy this thing. Just get that thing. Just X number of followers or likes on social media. They don't accomplish what we think they're going to, what they promise, right? Only God's promises can be fulfilled. He's the only one sufficient enough. That's why we come together and cry out to him, God, I need you. So that's where we've been going. This all fits together. It's all the nation of Israel and how they're relating to God and how they're relating to their circumstances in the era in which they find themselves. So here's a bit of a preview for our coming weeks. Fast forward to the last, believe it or not, historical narrative books of the Old Testament. They appear early, because historical books appear early in the Old Testament, and they're concurrent with the prophetic book of Malachi. Wait a minute, doesn't Malachi come at the end of the Old Testament? Yes, it does. Prophetic books, it's a minor prophet at the end. But historically, Ezra and Nehemiah actually happened around the time of Malachi, which is just before the 400 silent years. Between this time and Jesus coming, there's this gap. But just before that, we've got Malachi and we've got Ezra and Nehemiah. This is going to be fun exploring this together. I've really enjoyed it. Maybe it's exciting to you as it is to me. But let's watch this video, which is just a short introduction to the whole setting. So go ahead.
In most modern Bibles, these books are separate, but that division happened long after it was written. It was originally a unified work written by a single author. The story is set after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and its temple and took many of the people into exile. And this book picks up about 50 years later and tells the return of some Israelites to Jerusalem and then what happened when they rebuilt the city and their lives there. Specifically, the book focuses on 3 key leaders who led the rebuilding efforts. You have Zerubbabel, then Ezra, and then Nehemiah. And the book's design focuses on the efforts of each leader. Zerubbabel leads a large group of people back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. Then about 60 years later, Ezra arrives in Jerusalem to teach the Torah and rebuild the community. And then he's followed by Nehemiah, who leads the rebuilding of Jerusalem's walls. And these 3 stories are designed to be parallel. Each begins with the king of Persia, prompted by God to send the leader to Jerusalem, and he offers resources and support. And then each leader encounters opposition in their efforts, which they then overcome, but in a way that leads to a strange anticlimax in each of the 3 parts.
Okay, so the context is about 140 years after the destruction of Jerusalem and the forced captivity by Babylon, after the prophetic proclamations of Jeremiah 29 and 43, which we've just reviewed. Think of the events of Daniel and Esther, right? Persians had conquered the Babylonians by this point. So Babylonians, the Persians conquer them, and then the Persian kings start to release the nation of Israel back in groups. So this is also after some of the Jews have been allowed to return, like I said, to the promised land, Ezra and the temple restoration, but before Jerusalem's wall was rebuilt. The word rebuilt. We want to explore today in the coming weeks, when is it time to rebuild? And I've invited Connor to have we're going to have an interview together. Come on up. And I'll try to remember the questions that I said I would ask you and not surprise you. So come on up close. So Connor, you're doing some rebuilding of your own. I happen to see it in your shop. What exactly are you rebuilding? You're rebuilding a motor of some kind, but tell us about that.
Yeah, so it's the engine in our semi-truck on the farm. It's worn out, and
Okay, how many cylinders?
so it's a 6-cylinder Detroit 60.
Okay, you know what that is, right? No, I've seen it there, and I've seen the parts everywhere. Okay, yeah. So, why are you rebuilding it? What were the indicators that it needed to be rebuilt, or that you wanted to rebuild it?
It was running out of power, efficiency. It was burning a lot of oil. It was kind of just, it wasn't economical to use it anymore because it was like using more oil than fuel almost, and losing its power and its reliability and everything. So
Yeah, okay. So what were the alternatives to rebuilding it? Like, you didn't have to rebuild it. I mean, you did, but you didn't. So what could you have done other than rebuilding it?
we could have abandoned it and just like sold it and not got much money for that because, a truck that's not running very good is not worth a lot. Or we could have replaced the whole engine, but that's very expensive. Or we could have just parked it and never looked at it again, but that's kind of just like abandoning it. Yeah. So
Okay. All right. So what's been tricky about rebuilding it?
it's a learning process. I mean, I've done some engine work, but just the nuts and bolts get bigger. It's just more finicky, and then everything has to be very clean and tight and proper for it to work proper.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, sure. Now, you actually had to wait on some stuff as well, is that right?
yeah, as we dig into it, there's more and more parts to order and
Okay.
stuff to figure out and challenges to overcome. So
Yeah. So is this like a 2-day process?
no, it's more like a 2-month process.
2 months. Okay. Yeah. Understood. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that a lot. I'm learning even as I watch you do some of it here and there. So thanks, Connor. Appreciate it. Yeah. So yeah. Yay. It's interesting. Did you notice some of the things that he said? And we're going to come back to some of the things that he said as we go through this. When is it time to rebuild? Why would you rebuild? What can we learn from Nehemiah's story, and how can it inform our story? That's the question we're looking at. When we look at Old Testament history, this is actual history, historical narrative we call it. These aren't made-up stories. The story of Nehemiah, these are historical narratives, and they're more well-documented than any other historical events in history. I don't know if you know that. Scripture is incredibly accurate in its documentation of history. So how can Nehemiah's story, but when we look at narratives, we're not looking for, hey, let's do it exactly the way Nehemiah did it. For instance, the application of this is let's not build a brick stone wall around the community of Mir or Bashar or Alex. Like, that would be a very literal application. We've got to rebuild a wall. It's broken down. We don't have walls around here. I've been in China where there are walls around communities, and I was in Xi'an, the city where the Terracotta Warrior Museum is, and we actually rode bikes around the top of the wall. It's very wide, half as wide as maybe 20 feet wide, and it took us about an hour and a half to ride bikes around it. So it actually is about a 4 million person city, now probably 6 to 8 million. But the wall is only part of they call it a small city in China, really. The wall is a small part of it, and then most of the people live now outside of that wall. But originally, it was a very important wall. And the wall has been rebuilt for historic purposes like tourists coming to see it. But most cities have lost their walls. But what would be an application, or what can we learn from Nehemiah's story, or any story in the Old Testament, any historical narrative, that applies to us? We need to be careful about application. Some people said, well, we are the future nation of Israel, so every one of their promises applies to us. No, they don't, because God's not calling you back to the promised land physically. So therefore, we need to be careful about what promises apply. But there are principles. God doesn't change, and there are principles that apply to us. So how can Nehemiah's story inform our story? Let's watch a short video that introduces us specifically to chapter 1 here, and then we'll jump into some things that we can learn.
The film that you are about to see is based on an authentic journal written 2,500 years ago and recorded in the Bible. The author, an eminent Jew, is a high-ranking official in the court of the Persian king. Nehemiah, for they are coming to kill you. In the night, they will come to kill you. It all began in 538 BCE, when Cyrus issued a proclamation that caused great elation among the Jews. In an imperial order circulated throughout the Persian Empire, Cyrus allowed the Jews who had been exiled to Babylonia with the destruction of the first temple to return to the land of Israel. After 70 years in exile, tens of thousands of Jews left their home and went up to Jerusalem. But soon the enthusiasm faded, the stream of migrants dwindled, and those who arrived in Jerusalem found a city in ruins, its walls broken down, isolated and destitute. The Jews became easy prey for the surrounding nations. As hostilities mounted, life in Jerusalem became unbearable. The dream of the return to Zion was on the brink of collapse. On the other side of the world, far from the suffering of their brethren, the Jews prospered and produced dignitaries such as Nehemiah, the son of Hachaliah, a high-ranking official in the Persian court. In the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the capital city of Shushan, Hanani, one of my brethren, came from Judah with some men. I asked them about the remaining Jews who had been left behind from the captivity and about Jerusalem. And they told me, the remnant who were left behind from the captivity there in the province are in a terrible state and in disgrace, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates burnt. Distressed by the words of his brethren, Nehemiah wanders restlessly through the halls of the royal court, crying and praying. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when the wine was set before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. The troubled look on Nehemiah's face aroused the king's suspicions. The king said to me, "Why do you look troubled since you are not ill? It must be from evil intentions." Then I was very frightened. I said to the king, "Why should I not look troubled when the city where my ancestors are buried lies waste, its gates consumed by fire?" Nehemiah musters all his courage and implores the king, "If it pleases the king, send me to Judah, to the city where my ancestors are buried, so I can build it."
We may continue that in coming weeks, but this tells the story of Nehemiah 1 to 11 and into chapter 2 a little bit. So Nehemiah gets some bad news, and things are not going well. They are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall has been torn down. The gates have been destroyed. when I heard this, I sat down and wept. First of all, Nehemiah's response was he was heartbroken. We sometimes talk about, does your heart break for the things that breaks the heart of God? Things are not going well. They're in great, great trouble. His heart was just breaking, and he wept. Let's talk about bad news for a minute. What is the bad news? God's people were in trouble and disgrace. They were languishing, failing to thrive. That's another way of saying that. Their success indicators scored low, you might say. What were the success indicators? Torn down wall, torn down defenses, burned down gates. Those are specific things. Now keep in mind that the temple was in the works. Ezra had been there. Zerubbabel had been there. Ezra had been there. Nehemiah is the next one coming. And he says the walls and ruins, therefore, whatever good is happening in the city can't be protected from its opposition. It needs a wall. And by the way, there's no evidence that God said, Nehemiah, you should go and build a wall. This is something that he sensed, that he heard from God apparently. But this was, his broken heart led to a desire to do something. Okay? So that was some bad news. There's some hard truths that he had to deal with. So acknowledging hard truths takes a lot of courage. How many of you agree with that? Is it sometimes, there's other ways of dealing with it, but acknowledging difficult truths is not for the faint of heart or for those in denial. Acknowledging hard truths means confronting the brutal facts. I sat with somebody yesterday and I said, can we just state the obvious? You're accepting that your time on earth is limited. With your diagnosis, your time is short, isn't it? Yeah, it is. That's confronting brutal facts. That's a very mature thing for someone to say, my time is limited. Right? That's acknowledging hard truths. So what are some alternatives to acknowledging hard truths? Connor mentioned that, and there's some alternatives to, what's the hard truth? Well, this motor is inefficient. It's not going well. It's losing power. Right? There are a whole bunch of symptoms that indicate there are some hard truths to acknowledge. Well, the alternative to that is denial. That's not true. That truck looks fine to me. I saw it operate last fall during the harvest. It's fine. What's the problem? Okay? The other is anger. Shoot the messenger. So he goes to his dad, Dad, this thing's blowing smoke. It's inefficient. There's no power. There's this. There's that. And his dad says, shoot the messenger. You're out to lunch. You're wrong. You're fired. Canceled. Right? That's sometimes what we do. Cancel the person with the bad news. I know that would never happen in this relationship. Well, that's why I can joke about it. Or frustration. There's another one, defensiveness and blame. It's your fault. It's their fault. It's the manufacturers. It's this. It's how you drive it. It's that guy who drove it for about 5 minutes and almost put it in the ditch, that pastor guy we have on the farm. He did it. Yeah, he wrecked this motor. Refused to accept the blame. Or avoidance or compartmentalizing. In other words, it's not my problem. It'll go away. Someone else will address it. Or this is my favorite because I hear it all the time. Someone should. Have you ever said that or heard somebody say that in a meeting? That's a statement of, I am not going to be involved in this. I know there's something wrong, but I will not have a role because someone else should solve the problem. Okay? It's not my problem. So avoidance or compartmentalizing, it's somebody's problem, but not mine. Okay. So those are alternatives to acknowledging hard truth. And Nehemiah could have chosen any one of these. Not true. Shot the messengers who came. You guys don't know what you're doing. You're not good at assessing the needs of my people. Or let's just start blaming people, because blaming is a good solution, isn't it? It moves us forward. Blame never helps. It never helps. Okay? And then avoiding it, that never helps either. So Nehemiah's response included sadness. He sat down and wept. Sat down and wept. There was grief, there was mourning, there was lament. By the way, we come from an evangelical tradition, we might call it. We might even call it a fundamentalist or a fundagelical kind of a combination. We have a great history in some ways, and then some other things about us and our tradition that don't serve us well. And sometimes we fail to embrace lament. Sometimes we say, so we have a celebration of life. I watched Don Scott's celebration of life yesterday. It was great to celebrate Don Scott's life, Greg's stepfather. So it was a celebration. But if we were to say, we're only going to sing happy songs and there will be no crying here and there'll be no sadness, well, that's ridiculous. That's not, Jesus wept, his disciples wept. Everyone through Scripture. One of the prophets was called the Weeping Prophet and wrote a book called Lamentations, right? The Weeping Prophet, Jeremiah. So lament is good. See, sadness about the languishing or the failing to thrive of God's people is an important and appropriate response. We need to embrace sadness, grief, mourning, lament. We don't sing a lot of lament songs. And actually, if you pull all of the current hymns or choruses that are sung in North America over the last few years, they don't even rate in the 1%. And yet, over 35 to 40% of the psalms are lament. Some of the psalms are, God, please kill my enemies, because they really bug me. We don't sing those songs. God, please kill our enemies. But we'd be biblical if we did. We get most of our singing, or most of our hymns, or choruses and things from the Psalms, many of them. But we neglect the lament ones, the sad ones, the, hey, where are you, God? It's even Jesus used a lament psalm. Why have you forsaken me? Had God forsaken him? No, actually. He had not turned his back on him. And we often say that. No. God did not forsake Jesus. What Jesus is saying is, this is what it feels like to bear the sins of the world and for God to look upon this darkness and me to bear all this darkness. And so he says, like the psalmist, why have you forsaken me? Had God forsaken the psalmist who wrote that? No. But his perception was that God had forsaken him, so it's okay to say that. It's okay to say, I feel forsaken, God. Where are you? I feel alone. I feel like you're distant, like you're not with me. I feel. That's a feeling. It's okay. It's an appropriate response. Secondly, Nehemiah's response is fasting and prayer. 4 days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. Wow. We don't even do that for celebrations of life or funerals. In our culture, we don't allow ourselves to do this more than a few days. I've been in cultures where the body is literally in the living room and it's there for like a week. There's at least a week of mourning with the body visibly present in the living room. And so that's more. And other people had, in the Old Testament, mourning for an entire year for the loss of a spouse, a widow, for instance. So Nehemiah fasts, he gives up food, he mourns, he prays to God, and he feels forsaken. He does feel alone. He does feel sad. He feels grief. Third, Nehemiah confesses. That's his next response. Look down and see me praying night and day for your people Israel. As Jim said earlier, as he read the scripture, this is a prayer of intercession for his people. He's calling upon God for the sake of his people, not for himself. Moses often did this. He said, God, I know you want to kill these people, your people, but please don't. Remember your faithfulness, your promises, your goodness. Remember these are your people. Can you have mercy on them? And God sometimes would say, okay, yeah, I'll have mercy on them. Wow. You're praying on behalf of someone else, that God would have mercy on them. By the way, it's okay to pray that, even if somebody seems to deserve what they got. You know why? Because you probably deserve some of what you get. So it's okay. It's okay to ask God to mitigate the consequences of people's bad decisions. Hey, God, they made a bad financial choice, and now they're running out of food. So God, don't give them food. Teach them a lesson. Is that our prayer? No, our prayer was probably, you know what, that was a tough decision that led to them not having enough food, but here's some food. And God, would you mitigate? Would you be merciful to them? Because we all make stupid decisions. We all make misinformed decisions. We all make judgment errors, and we need God's mercy. So even then, we can intercede for others who we believe deserve what they got or don't deserve the kindness. That's what mercy is, undeserved grace and kindness. And he confesses on behalf of the people. He's not even there, but he confesses on behalf of the people who are back in Judah, in Jerusalem. I confess that we have sinned against you. Even my own family and I have sinned. We have sinned terribly by not obeying the commands, decrees, and regulations you gave us through your servant Moses. He says, I'm owning it on behalf of all of us. Wow, that's a big deal. Owning other people's stuff and sin and coming before God and confessing it to him corporately. Wow. Another response of Nehemiah is to appeal to God's character and promises. Oh, Lord God of heaven, you're the sovereign God, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of unfailing love with those who love him, obey his commands. Listen to my prayer. So God, hey, just reminding you, you're a good God. You're an awesome God. You're a powerful God. You're great. Hey, you're the one who keeps his covenant. By the way, the covenant of the Old Testament was a one-way. There was some two-way aspects of it, but God actually, with Abraham, went through the covenant process and didn't even involve Abraham. I don't know if you noticed that. We'll go into studying that sometime. But God was the one who formed the covenant. God's the one who keeps the covenant. And even when his people broke the covenant, there was faithfulness from God's perspective. Please remember what you told your servant Moses. If you return to me and obey my commands and live by them, then even if you were exiled to the ends of the earth, I will bring you back to the place I've chosen for my name to be honored. That's a promise to Moses. Nehemiah remembers it, or Nehemiah, as you heard on the video, depending on how you pronounce it. I will bring you back. So there is a promise, there is a condition here about what they can experience if so, and God is going to be faithful to his character and promises. So Nehemiah appeals to that. And then there's a plea for help. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you, like the song we sang. Oh, Lord, please hear my prayer. Listen to the prayers of those of us who delight in honoring you. Please grant me success today by making the king favorable to me. Put it into his heart to be kind to me. So he could only approach the king when the king wanted him to be there. And just like Queen Esther, he could only speak when he was spoken to and invited to speak. So he prayed for God's mercy, that he would be allowed to speak to the king on behalf of his people. Pretty gutsy. Could have led to his death. Well, let's turn to our own response. What tough news do we need to acknowledge? Sure, on a personal level, when I got a cancer diagnosis, I had to acknowledge and accept that that was tough news and that it was true. I was shocked at first, like many of you might be shocked if you get a diagnosis. It's tough news. So it could be something like that. But I'm thinking more corporately, on behalf of our whole church family. We've had some tough news over the last 5 years. Some of it's obvious. The pandemic, change in pastors. Functionally, we've had a couple of church splits. In other words, groups of people have left. That is tough. That's tough news. Can we just say that? Hey, that's been really hard. And I'm sad. I know we're feeling it. I hear signs for the last 2.5 years since we've been here. We've heard signs and heard feelings of, I'm grieving, I'm sad, I long for those days, I remember those days. That's called grief. That's sadness. That's good to acknowledge that. We've had financial challenges. Ann and I came expecting this salary, and then together we've had to discern that, okay, it's going to be this. Our lives are different. And your life is different. Our finances have been different the last year in particular. It's been hard. That's sad news. But what needs to break our hearts? What in all of this, how are our walls broken down? What might we need to confess? What might we need to weep about? Why might we need to fast and pray? And what might we need to confess? How do we need to appeal to God and plea for help? That's what our discernment times are about. Coming up this Friday and the weekend before, it was like, let's assess, let's get a proper objective assessment of reality. And there might be some things we need to be sad about, we need to confess, we need to appeal to God. And lastly, what are we hearing from Jesus about his desires for our future together? The end of this thing is not feeling sad and depressed. The end of this is trusting that God has a new season for us. Ann and I believe that. We believe that as elders, that we have a new season ahead of us. Those 18 of us who gathered last weekend, we really believe that God has a new season ahead, but we're not sure what it is because we need to hear from him. But like Nehemiah, we need to start by acknowledging the tough news, allowing it to break our heart, actually investing in a time of lament, prayer, fasting, confession, and appealing to God for help. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you.